The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Annie knew it was the end before she even broke the wax seal. The deep black stamp of the Ironvale crest, pressed into the burgundy wax like a wound that refused to close. She had been standing in the kitchen of the small stone cottage when the royal messenger knocked, his expression carefully blank, his gray cloak dusted with the first snow of the season. He had not looked at her directly. Messengers never looked at Omegas directly. She had set the letter on the wooden table and left it there for 3 hours. Now it was evening, and the fire had burned low, and Annie sat beside it with her hands folded over the swell of her abdomen, round and full and impossible to hide, beneath even the loose linen of her cream-colored dress. The gray wool cloak she'd draped over her shoulders smelled faintly of pine resin and dried lavender, the two things she had gathered compulsively during the long months of solitude, because they were the only smells that did not make her stomach turn. She finally read the letter. His Majesty, Alpha King Xander of the Iron Vale, hereby notifies his lawful mate of his intention to attend the estate at Veyrath's Edge on the 14th day of the frost month, to formalize the dissolution of their union before the council witnesses. The Omega is expected to sign the documents presented. No objections will be entertained. No delay will be granted. Annie folded the letter slowly. The fire crackled. Outside, snow was beginning to fall against the leaded glass windows, soft and indifferent. She pressed one hand flat against her stomach and felt the answer she had no words for yet. She had been sent to this cottage 7 months ago. Not in anger. Or at least, not in the kind of anger that comes with shouting. Xander did not shout. He was the sort of man whose fury arrived in complete silence, in the way a door could close with perfect gentleness, and still feel like the end of the world. He had come to her chamber that evening in early spring, with 2 of his council members at his back, and a single sentence prepared. You will reside at Veyrath's Edge until further arrangements are made. That was all. No explanation, no conversation. He had already been turning away when she asked why, and he had paused with his broad back to her, those wide shoulders wrapped in black leather, the fur mantle across them catching the torchlight, and said, without turning, "Because I cannot look at you right now, Annie." She had not seen him since. The cottage at Veyrath's Edge was not cruel. That, she supposed, was something. It sat at the far northeastern border of Ironvale territory, nestled against a ridge of pine forest where the wind came down from the mountains in long, mournful sweeps. The nearest village was a 2-hour ride by horse. A woman named Greta came twice a week with provisions, bread, dried meat, root vegetables, sometimes a small wedge of hard cheese, and never stayed long enough for real conversation. A young stable hand named Pell lived in the outbuilding and kept the single horse fed and the woodpile stocked, and he was perhaps 17 and spoke in monosyllables, and Annie had grown genuinely fond of him in the wordless way one grows fond of a faithful animal. She had learned the names of the birds that came to the windowsill. She had learned to make her own bread. She had learned what it felt like to be completely alone with the truth of herself, with no rank and no court and no one watching. And she had discovered, slowly, painfully, that the truth of herself was not as small as everyone had always made her feel. She was 23 years old. She was an Omega in a world that treated Omegas as decorative at best and expendable at worst. She had been given to Xander in a political arrangement 4 years ago, a peace offering from her father's failing bloodline to the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. She had arrived at the Ironvale Palace with a single trunk of belongings, and the quiet, unshakable understanding that she was not expected to matter. For 3 years, she had tried anyway. And then spring had come, and something had shifted, something brief and overwhelming and never spoken of again. And then Xander had sent her away, and now it was winter, and Annie was reading a letter about her own divorce by firelight, with his child curled beneath her ribs like a question she did not know how to answer. The 14th day of the frost month arrived with iron-gray skies and a wind that bit through stone walls. Annie was awake before dawn. She had barely slept. She dressed carefully, the warmest dress she owned, a deep charcoal wool with long sleeves, her brown leather belt cinched as high as it would go, which was not high enough to conceal anything. She braided her pale gold hair over one shoulder, the way she always did, and pulled her gray cloak around herself, and sat in the chair nearest the fire, and waited. She heard the horses before she saw them. 4 riders, then the unmistakable shape of the black carriage behind them, its wheels cutting dark lines through the snow-covered path. The Ironvale crest on the carriage door, the black fur pennants. Pell appeared at her door, looking wide-eyed and pale. "There's—" he started. "I know," she said quietly. "It's all right, Pell. Go back to the stable." She stood. She pressed both hands flat against the front of her dress, not to hide. It was past hiding. She pressed them there because it steadied her. That warmth, that solid and undeniable reality pressing back. The cottage door opened. Xander came in out of the cold, like the cold itself had taken a shape and decided to walk. He was exactly as she remembered. Larger than memory ever quite managed to preserve. His dark braids pulled back from a face that was all sharp edges and old iron. His blue eyes the same startling pale color they had always been, currently fixed on the middle distance the way they always were when he was controlling something internal with great effort. He was already speaking. A council member behind him was unrolling a scroll. Xander's mouth was forming the words that meant this ends today, and then his pale blue eyes dropped. They dropped to her abdomen, and they stopped. The room went absolutely silent. Annie watched the color leave his face, watched his jaw set, watched something move through those pale eyes that she had never, in 4 years, been able to name, and she had spent a great deal of time trying. The council member with the scroll had gone still. The second council member, an older woman named Hesta, who had always watched Annie with undisguised contempt, made a short, sharp sound that was not quite a word. Xander said nothing. He stood in the doorway of her small stone cottage with snow melting in his braids and the divorce papers in his second's hand, and he looked at Annie, really looked at her, for what felt like the first time in 7 months, and the expression on his face was not anger. She didn't know what it was. That was the most frightening thing. "Annie," he said. Just her name. His voice was very low. She lifted her chin. Her hands were steady against the wool of her dress. Her voice, when it came, surprised even herself with its quietness, its complete absence of apology. "Hello, Xander." The silence in the cottage stretched long enough to become its own kind of weather. Hesta was the one who broke it. She stepped forward past Xander's shoulder, her velvet traveling coat dark with melted snow at the hem, her iron-gray hair pinned beneath a stiff hood. She was a small woman who had always managed to take up a great deal of space, and she did so now, her sharp eyes moving over Annie with the practiced efficiency of someone appraising livestock at market. "This changes nothing," Hesta said flatly. "The dissolution was agreed upon by the council 3 months ago. A pregnancy does not—" "Hesta." Xander's voice did not rise. It did not need to. It landed in the room the way a sword lands when driven point first into stone, with finality, with weight, with the absolute expectation that everything nearby would go still. Hesta went still. He had not moved from the doorway. His pale blue eyes had not left Annie's face. The snow outside was picking up, tapping softly against the leaded glass, and the fire behind Annie had burned down to deep orange coals that threw long shadows across the stone floor. The cottage suddenly felt very small. "Leave us," Xander said. "My lord, the protocol requires that council witnesses remain present during any—" "I said leave us." The second council member, a thin, forgettable man named Osbert, who had spent the entirety of the journey thus far pretending not to exist, was already retreating toward the door. Hesta held her ground for exactly 2 more seconds, which was precisely 2 seconds longer than most people ever managed against Xander, and then she too moved, pulling the door shut behind her with a click that sounded like an accusation. The room held just the 2 of them, and the fire and the snow against the glass, and the impossible fact hanging between them in the air like smoke. Xander finally moved. He did not come closer. He turned slightly, as though looking at the wall were easier than looking at her, and removed his heavy fur mantle from his shoulders, and set it over the back of the nearest chair with the automatic precision of a man accustomed to moving through space, carefully, deliberately, always in control of himself. Beneath it, he wore the black leather vest she remembered, cross-strapped with thick brown harness buckles, his leather bracers still damp at the edges from the ride. He looked exhausted. She had not expected that. She had prepared for cold fury, for that particular brand of Xander silence that meant he had already decided everything and was merely waiting for the world to arrange itself accordingly. She had not prepared for the shadows beneath his eyes, or the tension in his jaw that looked less like anger and more like a man who had not slept well in a very long time. "How long?" he said. It was not quite a question. 7 months, Annie said, give or take a few days. Something moved across his face. A calculation, perhaps, or the memory of one. His eyes dropped again to her abdomen, and this time they stayed there for longer, and Annie resisted the urge to cover herself with her hands. She had spent 7 months learning to stop making herself smaller. She would not start again now, not even for him. "You knew," he said, "when you left." "No," she said honestly. "I didn't know until a month after I arrived here." "And you didn't send word. You told me no correspondence." His jaw tightened. "I told you no unnecessary correspondence." "I wasn't certain," Annie said quietly, "that you would consider this necessary." The words landed the way she had not entirely meant them to, not as an attack, but as the plainest possible description of what their marriage had actually been. What she had actually been. Inside it. Xander's eyes came back to her face, and something shifted in them, a tightening around the edges that might have been guilt if he were a man capable of wearing guilt openly, which he was not. He looked away. He moved to the window. He stood with his back to her and looked out at the snow covering the pine trees and the path, at the black carriages and the mounted guards, and the whole formal machinery of his authority arranged in her front yard like a siege. "The council will say it can't be verified," he said. His voice was controlled again, back behind the wall. "They'll argue the timing is—" "I know what the council will say," Annie interrupted, and the steadiness in her own voice surprised her again. "I've been sitting here alone for 7 months with nothing to do but think about what the council would say. I'm not asking anything of you, Xander. I want you to understand that. I'm not using this to stop the divorce or to claim anything. I just—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, decided. "I wanted you to know," she finished. "That's all. You deserve to know." He turned from the window. For a long moment he simply looked at her across the small stone room, the low fire between them, the smell of pine and old wood in the air, the snow-muffled silence pressing down over everything. She thought of the first time she had ever seen him, 4 years ago in the great hall of Iron Vale, when she had arrived with her father, and her single trunk, and her quiet understanding that she did not matter. He had looked at her then with the same expression he wore now, unreadable, still, like a lake frozen so thoroughly you could not tell how deep it went. She had spent 3 years trying to find out. She had never managed it. "Sit down," he said quietly. Annie blinked. "I'm fine standing." "Annie." There was something different in his voice when he said her name now. Not the cold command of the letter, not the distant formality of the palace. Something rougher at the edges. "Please sit down." She sat. Not because he asked, but because her feet were genuinely tired, and she was 23 and 7 months along, and had been awake since before dawn. She settled into the chair closest to the fire, her cloak falling around her, and watched him pull the other chair away from the table and lower himself into it with the careful movements of a man who had old injuries he refused to acknowledge. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his pale eyes on her. "Tell me," he said, "what these 7 months have actually been like." Annie stared at him. Of all the things she had imagined him saying, that had not appeared on the list. "Why?" she asked. "Because I'm asking." "You're asking now," she said, and she kept her voice even. "After 7 months of complete silence, with divorce papers in the carriage outside, and 2 council witnesses in the snow. You're asking now." "Yes," he said. Just that. No defense. No explanation. Annie looked at the fire for a moment. She thought about Greta with the bread, and Pell in the woodpile, and the birds on the windowsill, and all the long, quiet nights she had spent learning the shape of her own survival. She thought about what it meant that she could answer him honestly now, without her voice shaking. "It was hard," she said. "And then it was less hard. And then it became something I think I needed, even though I didn't choose it." Xander was quiet. His eyes were on her face, with an intensity that she recognized from those rare, unguarded moments in their marriage. Moments that had never lasted long enough. "I'm not the same person who left that palace," Annie said. "I need you to understand that before anything else happens today." He held her gaze for a long moment. "No," he said at last, and his voice was very quiet. "I can see that." Outside, the snow was thickening. The carriage sat motionless on the path. Inside her chest, something old and braced and carefully armored shifted the smallest fraction. Not opening, not yet, but acknowledging, reluctantly, that the conversation was not going the way either of them had planned. And somewhere between the fire and the window and the divorce papers still rolled inside their velvet ribbon in the carriage outside, the day that was supposed to be an ending had quietly, dangerously, become something else. Hesta did not wait in the cold gracefully. Annie could hear her through the thin cottage walls. The sharp click of boot heels against the frozen stone path. The low murmur of her voice directed at Osbert, clipped and dissatisfied in the way of someone accustomed to having their displeasure heard, even when they were pretending to be quiet. The guards near the carriage had gone still and watchful, their breath rising in pale clouds above their dark helmets, their eyes forward with the disciplined blankness of men paid to see nothing. Inside, Xander had not moved from his chair. He had asked her to tell him about the 7 months, and Annie had answered honestly. And then a silence had settled between them that was different from the silences she remembered from the palace. Those silences had always felt like walls. This one felt more like snow, blanketing, muffling, strangely soft at the edges. She was the one who broke it. "You should know," she said, keeping her eyes on the fire, "that I've already thought through every version of this conversation. Every possible thing you might say. Every argument the council makes. Every outcome. I've had 7 months and very few distractions." "And what conclusions did you reach?" Xander asked. "That I will not fight you," Annie said. "If you want the divorce, sign the papers. I won't contest it. I won't use the child to hold you to something you've already decided to leave." She paused. "But I will raise this child, Xander. Here, or somewhere. On my own, if necessary. I am not the same woman who would have quietly accepted whatever arrangement was made for her." He was looking at her directly now. She could feel it even without turning her head. "You never were," he said quietly. "Quiet. You were always—" He stopped, seemed to consider something. "I told myself you were." Annie turned to look at him then, because the sentence was strange enough to deserve it. He was sitting with his elbows still on his knees, his large hands loosely clasped, and the expression on his face was the one she had only ever seen in the very early mornings in their first year of marriage, when she would sometimes find him in the library before the palace woke, unguarded, unperformed, just a man sitting alone with something heavy on his chest. "Why did you send me away?" she asked. She had promised herself she wouldn't. The question came out anyway, low and direct. Not the council version, not the political reason. "Why did you actually send me away?" His jaw tightened. He looked at his hands. "Because something happened that I didn't know how to manage," he said at last. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The fire popped. A log shifted and sent a brief cascade of orange sparks up into the chimney throat. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a low, continuous sound like a held breath. Annie waited, and she did not fill the silence with reassurance the way she once would have. And eventually Xander looked up. "I've been Alpha King since I was 19 years old," he said. "My father died, and I was handed a territory in open conflict, and a council that was testing every boundary I had within the first week. I learned very quickly that the only safe thing was control. Of everything. Of myself most of all." His pale eyes were steady on hers. "You were the one thing in my life that I could not control. Not your loyalty, not your warmth, not the way you—" He stopped again. Something moved in his throat. "I didn't know what to do with that. So I told myself it was a liability." Annie was very still. "And when that stopped being something I could keep telling myself," he continued, his voice quieter now, "I panicked, in the only way I know how to panic, which is to remove the variable." "I am not a variable," Annie said softly. "No," Xander said. "You're not." The admission sat between them, fragile and enormous. Annie pressed her lips together. She was not going to cry. She had cried enough in the first 2 months at this cottage, alone by this same fire, and she had decided at some point in the 3rd month that she was finished crying over things she hadn't broken. but her chest ached with the particular pain of something true being said too late, and in the wrong place, with lawyers outside in the snow. "It doesn't fix anything," she said. "I know. Saying it now, like this, it doesn't undo 7 months. I know that too. Then why are you saying it?" He held her gaze. "Because you asked me for the real answer, and I find I'm..." A pause. Waited. "Tired of giving you anything else." A knock at the door interrupted whatever might have come next. It was Hesta. She opened the door without waiting for an answer, which was either courage or contempt. With Hesta, it was often impossible to distinguish between the two. The cold came in with her, sharp and immediate, carrying the smell of frost and horse and the faint iron scent of the guard's armor. "My lord," she said, her eyes going to Xander with the practiced urgency of a woman delivering news she knew would be unwelcome. "We've had a rider from the Eastern Pass. Lord Fenwick's men were seen crossing the Ashfeld border this morning, armed." The change in Xander was immediate, not dramatic. He did not stand suddenly or reach for a weapon. It was subtler than that, a gathering, a settling of something behind his eyes, the king reassembling over the man the way armor is strapped on piece by piece. "How many?" he said. 40 riders, perhaps more. The scout wasn't certain. "Fenwick," Annie said quietly. Both Xander and Hesta looked at her. Hesta with irritation, Xander with something more careful. "You know the name," he said. "Everyone at Veyrath's Edge knows the name," Annie said. "The village 2 hours south. They've been talking about Fenwick for months. Raids on the outer farms, livestock taken, a granary burned in the autumn." She paused. "I assumed you knew." Something flickered in Xander's expression, the briefest compression of his mouth, a telltale sign she had learned to read over years. He hadn't known, or hadn't known the extent of it. She watched him absorb that quietly, the way he absorbed everything, inward and without visible reaction. "The council had reports," Hesta said stiffly, "that were being evaluated." "The council had reports," Annie repeated mildly, "and the farms were still burning." Hesta's eyes sharpened. "You would do well, Omega, to remember that you are not..." "Hesta." Xander's voice again, flat as a blade laid on a table. "That's enough." The silence that followed had teeth. Hesta straightened, pressed her lips into a thin line, and directed her gaze toward the middle distance with the expression of someone storing an offense for later use. Osbert, who had appeared in the doorway behind her, seemed to be attempting to become part of the door frame. Xander stood. He was very tall in the low-ceilinged cottage, his head nearly at the level of the old wooden beams. He reached for his fur mantle where it lay over the chair back, and settled it across his shoulders in one practiced motion, and the king was fully assembled again, broad and dark and formidable, the pale eyes cold and focused. But he paused before turning to the door. He looked at Annie. Not the way he had looked at her in the palace. Past her. Through her. With that careful, trained distance. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for the last hour, with something open and undefended at the edges that didn't match the armor he'd just put back on. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly. "Not today." Annie blinked. "The documents. We'll wait." He held her gaze. "Fenwick won't. And I am not riding away from this cottage and leaving you and..." He stopped. His eyes dropped briefly, almost involuntarily, to her abdomen. Then back up. "I'm not leaving today." It was not an apology. It was not a declaration of anything she could have named. But it was Xander making a choice in front of witnesses. And in 4 years of marriage, she could count the times he had done that without political calculation on one hand. Hesta made a sound. "My lord, the border situation requires..." "Send word to Captain Aldrich," Xander said, already moving toward the door. "Tell him I want the eastern flank sealed before nightfall. Tell him to hold and not engage until I arrive." He paused at the threshold, the cold gray light falling across his profile. "And have someone bring firewood inside. Enough for the night." He stepped out into the snow. Hesta followed, pulling the door shut behind her with considerably less restraint than before. Annie sat alone by the fire. The cottage was quiet again. The particular quiet of a room that had recently held something significant, and was still settling back into its shape. She placed one hand over her stomach, and felt the small, insistent movement there, that had become the most reliable thing in her world. "I know," she murmured, to no one, to both of them. "I don't know what any of this means either." But outside, through the leaded glass, she could see him standing in the snow giving orders. And for the first time in 7 months, the sight of him did not make her feel like something was ending. It made her feel, with a caution she did not entirely trust, like something was beginning. The night came early, the way it always did in the frost month at Veyrath's edge. By the time the sun dropped behind the pine ridge to the west, the sky had gone the color of a bruise, deep purple at the edges, fading to a cold charcoal gray overhead. And the temperature fell with it, sudden and serious, the kind of cold that found every gap in stone and wood and wool and settled in without apology. Annie had added 3 logs to the fire and moved the iron pot of broth she'd started that morning closer to the heat, and the cottage had filled with the warm, dense smell of root vegetables and dried herbs and wood smoke. Something so fundamentally different from the cold grandeur of the Ironvale Palace that it sometimes felt like proof she had become a different person entirely. Pell had brought the firewood inside as instructed, wide-eyed and moving quickly, clearly overwhelmed by the presence of royal guards in his stable yard, and then disappeared back to the outbuilding with the relieved speed of someone excused from a situation they hadn't asked to be part of. Greta, who had the misfortune of arriving with the week's provisions in the middle of all of it, had taken one look at the Ironvale carriages, and the black-cloaked guards, and the figure of Xander standing in the snow, and had set her basket down inside the door without a single word, and left at a pace that was not quite running. Annie had found herself almost amused by it. Almost. Osbert had retreated to the carriage as soon as darkness began to gather. 2 guards remained at the path's edge, motionless as carved stone. Hesta had stationed herself near the carriage door with a traveling blanket over her shoulders and the rigid posture of a woman who considered discomfort a personal insult. Xander came back inside as the last light died. He brought the cold in with him, and snowmelt in his braids, and the particular focused tension of a man who had spent the last 2 hours giving orders and receiving reports and managing a border situation from a remote cottage with no war table and no maps. He stood just inside the door for a moment, and Annie watched him take in the fire and the pot and the 2 wooden bowls she had set on the table without making any particular decision about it. Just doing it, the way she did most things now, practically and without ceremony. "Aldrich has the eastern flank," he said, pulling his bracers loose and setting them on the side table by the door. "Fenwick won't cross further tonight. The cold will slow his men even if his ambition doesn't slow him." "Will it be a real conflict?" Annie asked. "With Fenwick, it's always real." Xander moved to the fire, held his hands out toward the heat with a weariness he didn't bother to conceal. "He's been testing the eastern borders for 2 years. Small provocations, each one just below the threshold that would justify a full response. He's patient, for a man with his particular appetites. What does he want? What all of them want?" Xander's voice was dry. Territory, legitimacy, to be the man who finally found the crack in Ironvale's foundation. A pause. "He believes the council instability around our situation has created an opening." Annie absorbed this quietly. She reached for the ladle and stirred the broth, watching the pale rounds of parsnip turn slowly in the steam. "So our divorce is a military vulnerability. According to Fenwick's scouts, apparently. And according to your council." Xander was quiet for a moment. He pulled the second chair back from the table and sat. The same chair he'd occupied that morning, as though he'd established some claim to it without meaning to. "Hesta believes the dissolution should proceed regardless, that showing Fenwick a unified front is impossible at this point, and the cleaner move is to finalize the separation and present me as available to a politically strategic alternative." The word available landed in the room with a particular kind of weight. Annie kept her eyes on the broth. "And what do you believe?" "I believe," Xander said slowly, "that Hesta has been planning my remarriage for longer than she's admitted, and that Fenwick is a convenient argument rather than the actual reason." Annie looked up at that. His pale eyes were on her, and there was something in them she recognized from the early morning library, that unguarded quality, the exhaustion of a man who had run out of energy for performance. "There's someone she has in mind," Annie said. It was not quite a question. "There usually is." She nodded once, and looked back at the fire and did not say anything about how that felt. The image of Hesta in some palace corridor, already making arrangements, already measuring the space Annie had occupied for replacement. She had promised herself she would not perform grief for things she hadn't broken. She kept that promise now, quietly, while she poured broth into the 2 bowls and set one in front of Xander without asking if he wanted it. He looked at the bowl, then at her. Something moved in his jaw. "Annie, eat," she said simply. "You've been in the cold for 2 hours and you have a border conflict and you rode here this morning from God knows how far. Eat." A long pause, then quietly. "From the capital. I rode from the capital." She sat down across from him. "That's 2 days' ride. Yes. You came yourself." She looked at him steadily. "You could have sent a representative for the signing. I could have. Why didn't you?" He picked up the wooden spoon, turned it once in his hands, set it back down. "Because some things should not be done by representative," he said. "Whatever I am, I'm not a man who ends a 4-year marriage with a signature delivered by courier." Annie held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked down at her own bowl. "That's the most honorable thing you've said to me in a very long time." "I have not been," he said carefully, "particularly honorable toward you in a very long time." The fire moved. The wind pressed against the glass. Between them, the broth steamed gently in the wooden bowls, and the homely smell of it, so completely ordinary, so utterly unlike anything that had ever existed in the Ironvale Palace, seemed to be the only honest thing in the room. They ate in silence, but it was a different silence than before. It had texture to it, and weight, and underneath it the slow movement of something shifting. It was Pell who found the tracks. He came to the cottage door just after the 8th hour bell from the distant village carried faintly on the wind, a sound Annie had learned to count without thinking, and he knocked twice in the rapid way that meant something was wrong. She opened the door to find him breathless, his young face white in the torchlight, snow on his boot tops from where he'd come through the deeper drifts near the tree line. "Tracks in the east wood," he said. "Not animal. Boot prints. 4, maybe 5 sets, coming from the direction of the high road." Xander was behind Annie before she had finished processing the words. He had moved from the table to the door with a speed that was slightly wrong for a human body, smooth and immediate and predatory, in the way that reminded her, sharply, that he was not merely a man. The alpha beneath the king was always present. It simply waited. "How fresh," he said. "An hour, maybe less," Pell said, his voice catching slightly under the force of Xander's attention. The snow hadn't filled them yet. Xander turned back inside, and Annie stepped out of his path automatically, and he crossed to the side table and picked up his bracers, and began fastening them with swift, practiced movements. "Wake the guards," he said to Pell, "and stay in the stable. Lock the door and do not open it for anyone whose voice you don't know." Pell nodded and disappeared at a run. Annie watched Xander pull his fur mantle back on. The shift in him was complete now. No trace of the man at the table with the wooden spoon, just the Alpha King, settled fully back into his authority, reading the situation with cold clarity. He reached for the short blade at his belt, checked it, replaced it. Then he stopped. He turned and looked at Annie with an expression that was not the strategic assessment he'd just been giving to everything else. It was direct and unarmored and completely at odds with the rest of him. "You will bolt this door," he said. "You will not open it. You will stay near the fire and away from the windows." "I know how to stay safe," she said. "I know you do." He held her gaze. "I'm asking anyway." There was something beneath the words that was not a command. She recognized it because she had spent 4 years learning the difference between Xander giving orders and Xander asking. And asking was so rare from him that it always landed differently, softer, and more serious at once. "All right," she said quietly. He held her gaze one moment longer. His pale eyes moved, just briefly, downward and back up. That involuntary glance she had caught him making all day, checking, acknowledging, unable to quite stop himself. Then he stepped out into the dark and the cold, and Annie bolted the door behind him, and stood in the firelit silence listening to the sound of guards mobilizing in the snow outside, and something in her chest, pulling taut like a bowstring. In the east wood, somewhere between the pine trees and the high road, something was moving toward them, and she had a terrible, certain feeling that Fenwick's name was on it. The attack came just before midnight. Annie heard it before she understood what she was hearing. A short, sharp shout from one of the guards, then the unmistakable percussion of bodies in motion. Boot heels against frozen ground, the ring of steel briefly exposed to cold air. She had stationed herself exactly where Xander had told her to, in the chair nearest the fire, away from the windows, with her gray cloak pulled around her, and both hands flat against her stomach, the way they always went when she was frightened and trying not to show it to herself. She counted breaths. It was something she had learned in the long nights at this cottage, that counting breaths gave the mind something to hold on to when everything else was moving too fast. 1, 2, 3. A heavier sound now, something falling, a voice she didn't recognize barking an order in the dark. Then Xander's voice, not words, just the tone of it, carrying across the frozen yard with a kind of authority that didn't need volume to be absolute. 4, 5. Silence. Then footsteps on the path, measured and familiar, and a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate raps, the pattern Xander had established before leaving without telling her he was establishing a pattern. Because that was the way he operated, quietly arranging safety for people without announcing that was what he was doing. Annie unbolted the door. He was standing in the torchlight with snow on his shoulders, and a cut along his left forearm that had bled through the leather of his bracer. Not deep, from the look of it, but real. Behind him, 2 of Fenwick's men were on the ground in the snow with their hands bound, and the other guards were moving through the tree line with torches, searching the wood with the efficient thoroughness of men who had done this before. The cold air that came in with him smelled of iron and pine and frozen earth. His eyes went to her immediately, straight to her face, then down, then back up. "I'm fine," she said, before he could ask. "Are you?" He looked down at his arm as though he'd forgotten about it. "Yes. That needs to be cleaned. It's minor." "Xander." She stepped back and held the door open. "Come inside." She cleaned the cut at the table while he sat still and let her, which was itself remarkable. She used the clean linen she'd torn from an old underdress and the small jar of pine resin salve that Greta had brought weeks ago, and she worked carefully and without fuss, while he sat with his arm extended, and his eyes on the side of her face with that unguarded quality that the long night seemed to have stripped him down to permanently. "There were 5 of them," he said. "Fenwick's scouts. They weren't here by accident. They knew you were here. They knew I'd come here today." A pause. "Which means someone in my own council sent word ahead." Annie's hand stilled for just a moment on the linen. Then she continued working. "Hesta," she said softly. Xander was quiet. "I'm not accusing," Annie said carefully. She is the one who benefits most from the dissolution moving forward. And from you being..." She stopped, started again. "If something had happened to you tonight, here, at this cottage, the narrative would have written itself. The unstable border, the inconvenient Omega, the king who made himself vulnerable by riding out personally to handle his own domestic situation." She tied the linen bandage and sat back. "It would have been very clean," she finished. Xander looked at his wrapped arm for a long moment. The fire was low and golden, and the cottage was very quiet. The sounds of the guards outside reduced now to distant murmurs. His jaw was set in the way that meant he had already reached the same conclusion, and did not enjoy having it confirmed. "She came to me in the autumn," he said. "After you'd been here 3 months. She told me the council was losing confidence in the stability of my rule. That an unmated alpha king with an Omega sequestered at a border estate was a liability. A symbol of disorder." His voice was flat. "She told me the dissolution would strengthen my position, that a new alliance through remarriage would close the vulnerabilities Fenwick was circling." "And you believed her," Annie said. "Not an accusation, just true." "I wanted to believe her," he said. "It was easier than the alternative." "What was the alternative?" He looked at her then, and the answer was on his face so plainly that the words were almost unnecessary. "Coming here," he said, "sooner, without the papers." Hesta was brought inside an hour later. Not in chains. Xander was not a man who humiliated people publicly when a private confrontation would serve better, but with 2 guards at her back and the absolute understanding that this was not a request. She came in with her chin high and her iron-gray composure intact, and she looked around the cottage with the expression of someone refusing to acknowledge that the terrain had shifted beneath them. "My lord," she began. "The scouts knew my route," Xander said. He was standing near the fire, arms crossed, and the king was fully present now. Not cold exactly, but precise, the way a blade is precise. They knew the timing. They knew I would be here, and largely unguarded because I'd ridden with a small escort to avoid drawing attention to a private matter. He paused. Only the council knew those details. Hesta's composure held. It was genuinely impressive. "My lord, the suggestion that I would—" "I'm not suggesting," Xander said. "I'm telling you what I know, and giving you the opportunity to decide how you'd like the rest of this evening to proceed." A long silence. The fire moved. The wind pressed at the glass. And then, in the way of someone who has calculated and found the calculation failing, Hesta's composure shifted. Not collapsed, but adjusted, reorganized into something colder and more honest. "You were destroying yourself," she said. Slowly, stubbornly, over a woman who cannot give Ironvale what it needs. An Omega with no political bloodline, no alliances, no leverage. A king unmated in the eyes of the council while his enemies grew bolder. I did what needed doing. "You decided what needed doing," Xander said, "without my knowledge or consent, and men came to this cottage tonight to kill me." "To frighten you," Hesta said sharply, "to move you faster toward—" Enough. The word dropped into the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples of it silenced everything. Hesta closed her mouth. The guards behind her were perfectly still. "You will return to the capital under guard," Xander said. "You will be held pending a full council inquiry. You will not speak to Osbert or anyone else in this escort before you arrive." He held her gaze. "And you will understand that the only reason you are not in chains right now is 30 years of service that I am choosing, at considerable effort, to remember." Hesta looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Annie, and for the first time in 4 years, the contempt in her expression was absent, replaced by something that might have been, in another woman, in another moment, the beginning of understanding. She left without another word. After she was gone, the cottage settled into a quiet that felt entirely different from every quiet that had come before it. Xander stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the snow and the trees and the torches of his guards moving through the dark. Annie sat by the fire and did not rush him. She had learned, over 7 months of solitude, that not every silence needed to be filled. When he finally turned, he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the long ride or the cold or the brief fight in the snow. It was a deeper tiredness, the kind that lives in decisions long deferred. He crossed the room and stopped before her chair and looked down at her with those pale blue eyes that she had spent 4 years trying to read and had finally, tonight, managed to. "I don't want to sign those papers," he said. Annie looked up at him. "That's not the same as knowing what you do want." "No," he agreed, "but it's the most honest thing I've said in months, and I'm starting there." He reached down, slowly, and she watched his large hand extend toward her, not commanding, not claiming, just offering, and after a moment she took it, and his fingers closed around hers with a careful, deliberate warmth. "I would like to stay," he said. "Through the winter. Here, if you'll have me, not as your king, not with council witnesses or political arrangements, just—" He paused. "As the man who rode 2 days to see you and found he had no language for what that meant until tonight." Annie felt something in her chest break open that she had been keeping carefully sealed for 7 months. Not the old longing, not the desperate hoping of the woman she had been. Something steadier than that. Something that had been built in solitude and silence, and the slow, hard work of becoming herself. "You can stay," she said quietly. "But I need you to understand that I am not the Annie who will disappear into whatever shape is convenient. Not anymore." "I know," he said. "I don't want that, Annie. I want—" His jaw worked. "I want to know the one who's been here. The one who learned the birds' names and talked to a 17-year-old stable hand and cleaned a soldier's cut at a kitchen table without flinching." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned her hand in his, so that their palms were flat together, and she felt the warmth of it travel all the way up her arm and into the hollow of her chest, where the fear had lived. "Then stay," she said. Epilogue. Spring came to Veyrath's edge the way it always did. Gradually, then suddenly, the snow retreating up the hillsides as though reluctantly admitting defeat. The pine forest releasing a green smell so intense it was almost physical. The cottage that had been a place of exile became something else entirely. It became, without anyone making a formal declaration about it, a home. Xander had sent for documents, not divorce papers, but different ones. He restructured the Eastern Council, installing a younger man named Kale in the seat Hesta had occupied for 3 decades. Hesta herself was tried quietly and sentenced to a decade of enforced retirement on her family's distant estate, stripped of her council authority, but spared the harsher judgment that her actions might have warranted. Xander was not a merciful king by nature, but he was a precise one, and precision sometimes looked like mercy. Osbert, largely blameless and largely spineless, was reassigned to a provincial record-keeping post that suited him completely. Lord Fenwick, deprived of his inside intelligence and finding Ironvale's eastern border sealed and reinforced under Captain Aldrich's immovable authority, retreated to his own territory and spent the next several years making noise that amounted to nothing. He would never find the crack in Ironvale's foundation, because the crack he had been counting on had quietly been filled. In the middle of a warm spring night, with the window cracked to let in the pine-scented air, and Xander's hand in hers, Annie brought their daughter into the world. The child arrived loud and insistent, and entirely certain of her own importance, which Xander said was a quality he recognized, and Annie laughed. A real laugh, open and unguarded, and the sound of it filled the cottage, and went out through the open window and scattered into the spring dark. They named her Wren, after the small brown bird that had come to Annie's windowsill every morning for 7 months without fail, regardless of the cold. Pell, who had been awake in the stable all night pretending he wasn't waiting, cried a little when he was told, and denied it, and brought an extra bundle of firewood that nobody needed. The formal return to the Ironvale capital happened 6 weeks later, when Annie was ready, and not before. She rode in, not in a closed carriage at the back of the procession, the way she had arrived 4 years earlier, but beside Xander at the front, on a gray horse that Xander had chosen for her himself, with Wren wrapped against her chest in a sling of soft wool. The people of the capital who lined the road to watch them pass saw something they had not expected. Their Alpha King, composed as ever, turning his head to say something quietly to the woman beside him, and the woman beside him laughing again, and Xander's expression in the moment after doing something it had never done in public in the 14 years of his reign. It softened. Just briefly. Just enough for the people nearest the road to see it and remember it and speak of it afterward, in the way of people who have witnessed something small and real and therefore more significant than anything grand. Annie became, in time, not the Omega Queen who had been sent away, but the queen who had survived the sending and come back different and changed everything quietly by refusing to be diminished. Her voice in council was not loud, but it was consistent, and it was grounded in something most council members lacked. She had lived at the edge of the territory, alone, without comfort or ceremony, and she knew what the land and the people on it actually needed, because she had been one of them. Xander learned, slowly, imperfectly, with occasional reversions that Annie met with patience she had not known she possessed, to let someone matter to him without calling it a liability. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. He did it anyway. And in the east wing of the Ironvale Palace, in a room that caught the morning light, a small brown bird was painted on the wall above a wooden cradle, put there by Xander himself, in the early hours of a morning when he thought no one was watching, with a brush too small for his hands, and a care that made the work take twice as long as it should have. Annie found it the first morning they were home. She stood in the doorway looking at it for a long time. Then she went to find him. And when she did, she said nothing. Because some things were beyond language, and simply took his hand. And they stood together in the growing light, while their daughter slept in the room behind them, and the world outside continued its business of being ordinary and extraordinary all at once. It was not a perfect life. It was not a story that resolved into ease or forgot its difficult parts. But it was theirs, built from a winter's worth of honesty, and a 7-month exile, and a letter that had arrived on a Tuesday, and changed everything by almost ending it. And that, in the end, was more than enough.